The city thrummed with its familiar nocturnal heartbeat, a symphony of restless energy that pulsed through every corner. Headlights darted through the darkness like fleeting fireflies, their beams slicing across the worn brick facades and cracked concrete streets. Neon signs hummed overhead, bathing the urban sprawl in their icy, unnatural glow, pink and blue and green bleeding into one another, painting the night with a sterile shimmer. Somewhere off the main drag, down a narrow side street, a lone street lamp flickered, casting a harsh circle of light that seemed more judgmental than illuminating. Beneath it walked Jalen Adams, his sneakers scuffing softly against the pavement, his breath visible in the cool March air. His mind was still buzzing with the echoes of the night-warm laughter, clinking glasses, the easy chatter of friends who'd gathered to shake off the weight of a grueling week. For once, he'd felt unburdened, free to let his guard down, if only for a few precious hours. But even amid the joy, a quiet thread of unease had woven itself through his thoughts, a shadow he couldn't quite shake. As he turned onto a quieter stretch of road, the din of the city softened, replaced by the low hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves skittering across the asphalt. Jalen adjusted his jacket, pulling it tighter against the chill, and let his shoulders relax. It had been a good night. He told himself, a rare chance to breathe, to feel human. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught it, a sudden flash of red and blue, sharp and insistent, cutting through the dimness behind him. His chest tightened instantly, a visceral knot of dread coiling in his gut. It was a reflex he'd honed over years, one he hated but couldn't unlearn. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking home, hands in plain sight, posture steady. He knew the routine, the unspoken rules drilled into him since he was old enough to wander these streets alone. Still, when the police cruiser eased up beside him, tires crunching over loose gravel, and two officers stepped out, that familiar wave of apprehension crashed over him, cold and suffocating. "Hey, you there," the voice sliced through the stillness like a razor, sharp and unyielding. Jalen froze mid-step, his pulse quickening as he drew a slow, deliberate breath. He turned to face them, his expression calm but guarded. "Yes, sir," he said, voice steady, though inside, his thoughts churned like a storm gathering strength. The older officer, James Turner, stepped forward, his weathered face etched with lines of authority and something darker disdain, perhaps, or a weariness that had long since curdled into contempt. His eyes bore into Jalen, heavy and unblinking, sizing him up as if he were a puzzle to be dismantled. Behind him stood Samuel Reed, younger and greener, his posture stiff with a tension that betrayed his inexperience. Reed's face was a mask, unreadable yet taut, like a man still grappling with the weight of the badge he wore. He'd joined the force with dreams of making a difference, of shielding his community from harm. But nights like this gnawed at those ideals, leaving him stranded between instinct and obedience. "Didn't you see the pedestrian crossing light back there?" Turner's tone carried a faint edge of accusation, his words dripping with a challenge Jalen recognized all too well. Jaywalking, he called it, though Jalen knew he'd stepped carefully across the street. Just a few strides from the Canerno reckless sprint, no chaos in his wake. He hesitated, his mind racing to piece together the officer's intent. This wasn't about a traffic violation, it was something deeper, something uglier. He felt the first flicker of injustice ignite in his chest, but he smothered it, knowing resistance would only tighten the noose. "My apologies, officer," he said, his voice measured, respectful, though every syllable felt like a concession he shouldn't have to make. "I wasn't aware." He kept his eyes lowered, not out of cowardice, but out of survival, a tactic he'd learned from watching others navigate these treacherous waters. Turner's lip twitched, a sneer curling at the corner of his mouth as if Jalen's restraint offended him. "You weren't aware," he mocked, his voice rising with a venom that made Jalen's skin prickle. "What, you think you're clever, huh? Just out here taking a little midnight stroll, too good for the rules." The words landed like blows, each one stoking the embers of anger Jalen fought to keep buried. He swallowed hard, the taste of bile rising in his throat as he wrestled with the urge to push back. He'd seen this script play out before, friends, cousins, neighbors ensnared in these petty traps, minor infractions twisted into something monstrous by men who wielded power like a weapon. "I'm just trying to get home, officer," he said, his tone still even, though the effort to hold it steady left his jaw aching. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, a storm cloud ready to burst. Turner took a step closer, his boots thudding against the pavement, and thrust out a hand. "Let's see some ID," he demanded, his fingers already curling as if anticipating resistance. Jalen's stomach lurched, but he moved slowly, deliberately, fishing his wallet from his pocket with hands he forced to stay visible. He handed over the card, and Turner snatched it, his eyes scanning it with a predatory intensity, searching for a crack, a flaw, anything to justify the suspicion he'd already decided was truth. Behind him, Reed shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Jalen and his partner. There was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a silent question he didn't dare voice. He'd signed up to protect, not to harass, but the weight of Turner's authority pinned him in place, muting the protest that clawed at his conscience. Turner thrust the ID back at Jalen, his stare lingering, cold and unyielding. Then, as if a switch had flipped, his expression darkened further. "Why don't you come with us?" he said, jerking his head toward the cruiser. The words weren't a question, they were a command, laced with a menace that made Jalen's blood run cold. "With all due respect, sir," he replied, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts. "I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just trying to get home." Turner's lips twisted into a humorless smirk, his eyes glinting with something cruel. "Oh, you're just trying to get home," he parroted, mockery dripping from every word. "What? You think you're above the law? Just a good little kid who doesn't have to answer to anyone." The taunt struck deep, piercing the fragile shield of calm Jalen had clung to. For a fleeting moment, his mask slipped, and he lifted his gaze, a spark of defiance flaring in his dark eyes. "Is there a reason I'm being stopped, officer?" The question hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. A gamble he knew could tip the night into chaos. He hadn't meant to ask it, not relive the need for dignity, for some shred of justice, had clawed its way out. Turner's jaw tightened, his hand flexing near his belt as if itching to act. "You want to play it that way? Fine." Before Jalen could blink, Turner lunged forward, his hand slamming into Jalen's shoulder with a force that sent him staggering back against the cruiser. Time slowed in that instant, the world narrowing to a single, deafening heartbeat. A high-pitched ringing filled Jalen's ears as he stumbled, his hands shooting up instinctively. Howaity didn't do anything, his voice cracked, raw with desperation. But the plea only seemed to stoke Turner's fury. "Hands on the hood, now," the officer barked, shoving Jalen forward until his cheek pressed against the cold, unforgiving metal of the cruiser. Pain flared as Turner twisted his arms behind his back, cuffing him with a brutal efficiency that spoke of habit, not necessity. Jalen's vision blurred, his chest heaving as the reality sank in was being stripped of his humanity, reduced to a target for someone else's rage. Reed watched, his face paling, his hands twitching at his sides. He wanted to step in, to call out the excess, the wrongness of it all. He could feel the bile rising in his throat, the shame of standing by as a witness to this abuse. But the chain of command, the unspoken code, held him fast, a rookie too afraid to challenge the veteran's wrath. A small, trembling voice in his mind screamed that this wasn't justice, but louder voice, those of duty, of survivor, kept him silent, complicit. As Turner yanked Jalen upright and shoved him into the back of the cruiser, the boy's body ached, his spirit bruised but not broken. He sat in stunned silence, the hum of the engine vibrating through him as the city lights streaked past the window. In a blur of color, the injustice burned like a live wire in his chest, searing through the numbness. He hadn't sought this fight, had bent over backwards to avoid it, but now, as the cruiser carved through the restless night, a quiet resolve took root. This wasn't the end. He wouldn't let it be. Turner and Reed, oblivious in their arrogance and uncertainty, had no inkling of the fire they'd ignited. Jalen wasn't just another faceless name to be processed and discarded. He was a spark, a reckoning, and the consequences of this night, the raw truth of power abused and justice denied, would ripple far beyond these streets, shaking the city to its core. The night was still, cloaked in a quiet that wrapped the empty street like a blanket, when a sudden burst of blue and red lights sliced through the darkness. The colors danced across the pavement, sharp and relentless, shattering the calm with their piercing glow. Jalen's stomach twisted into a tight knot, a reflex honed over years of encounters that had taught him to brace himself. At the sight of those lights, they didn't mean safety to him, not anymore, if they ever had. To him, they were a signal of something far more menacing, a prelude to scrutiny and suspicion he'd done nothing to earn. He stood frozen for a moment, his breath catching as the police cruiser rolled up beside him, its headlights pinning him in place like an actor caught center stage in a play he hadn't auditioned for. Two officers emerged from the vehicle, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the asphalt, looming larger than life in the dim streetlight. The first, Officer James Turner, was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements. His hat cast a shadow over his face, leaving only the glint of his narrowed eyes visibilized that bore into Jalen with a coldness that rivaled the bite of the night air. Turner was a veteran of the force, a man whose decades of service had hardened him into something unyielding. His patience for anyone he labeled a troublemaker had eroded long ago, replaced by a cynicism that colored every step he took. Beside him was Officer Samuel Reed, younger and less seasoned, his frame buzzing with a nervous energy that seemed to crackle in the air. Reed was still adjusting to the weight of his badge, still finding his footing in a role that demanded certainty he hadn't yet mastered. His eyes darted between Turner and Jalen, betraying a flicker of unease he couldn't quite hide. Jalen's heart thudded in his chest, a frantic rhythm he fought to control as he instinctively spread his hands out to his sides open, visible, unthreatening. He knew how the scene looked, a lone young black man on a street abandoned by the bustle of daytime, a tableau that too often spelled trouble in the eyes of those who didn't bother to look deeper. Appearances, he'd learned, could outweigh truth in moments like these, and the weight of that knowledge pressed down on him as heavily as the night itself. "Hey, you there!" Turner's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and edged with an accusation that needed no explanation. It wasn't a greeting, it was a challenge, a demand for Jalen to justify his existence in this space. Jalen stopped in his tracks, his mind spinning as he searched for the perfect response with right words, the right tone, the right tilt of his shoulders to diffuse the tension coiling around them. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Turner's eyes narrowed further, suspicion etching deeper lines into his weathered face. "You in a hurry or something?" he pressed, his tone laced with a skepticism that felt personal. Jalen forced a smile, a polite, practiced curve of his lips he'd perfected over years of navigating these fraud encounters. It was a shield, a fragile offering of deference meant to signal compliance. "No, sir," he replied, each word measured and careful. "Just on my way home." But Turner wasn't appeased. "On your way home," he echoed, twisting the phrase into something dubious, something that sounded like a lie caught mid-flight. "You know it's late, right? Not exactly safe for someone like you to be wandering around out here." The jab landed hard, a subtle sting wrapped in concern that Jalen knew wasn't genuine. He swallowed the flare of resentment rising in his throat and nodded. "Yes, sir, I understand." Turner's lips curled into a smirk, a faint, mocking twist that made Jalen's skin prickle. "You understand, huh?" He stepped closer, his gaze raking over Jalen's face, his clothes, his stance searching for a flaw, a crack, anything to justify the unspoken verdict he'd already reached. "I saw you cross that street back there," Turner added, his voice deceptively calm, but threaded with a tension that set Jalen's nerves on edge. "Did you miss the crosswalk, or do you just not care about the law?" For a heartbeat, Jalen's mind scrambled to piece together the moment Turner was referencing. He'd crossed the street a few steps from the corner, glancing both ways to ensure no cars were coming. A small, instinctive choice born of habit, not defiance, jaywalking. That was the thread Turner had seized upon, the flimsy excuse for this interrogation. "My apologies, officer," Jalen said, keeping his tone even, respectful. A tightrope walk between submission and dignity. "I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to," Turner interrupted, his voice rising, a spark of aggression igniting in the words. "So what were you doing then, huh? Trying to sneak off somewhere?" Jalen's composure faltered, a flicker of despair crossing his face before he locked it down again. He'd danced this dance before, knew the steps by heart. Stay calm, stay quiet, don't push back. No, sir, he said, forcing the indignation down, letting it burn silently in his chest. I'm just walking home. But his restraint only seemed to stoke Turner's fire. The officer's eyes glinted with a hard, unyielding edge, his lips curling into a smile that held no warmth. Got to be walking around like you own the place, he muttered, circling Jalen like a predator sizing up its prey. The words stung, each one a dart aimed at Jalen's pride, his sense of self. He felt the urge to speak up, to ask why they'd stopped him, to demand what crime he'd committed beyond existing in their line of sight. But he knew the stakes, knew that questions could escalate this, from uncomfortable to dangerous, in a heartbeat. With a slow, deliberate breath, he reached for his wallet, his movements telegraphed and cautious. He slid out his ID and offered it to Turner, who snatched it with a disdainful flick of his wrist. Behind Turner, Reed shifted on his feet, his hands twitching at his sides. His face was a mask of uncertainty, his eyes darting between his partner's imposing figure and Jalen's tense frame. He looked like he wanted to say something, to soften the moment, but the weight of his inexperience and his loyalty to Turner kept him mute. It was a small fracture in their united front, a hint that Reed wasn't fully committed to this charade. But it wasn't enough to change the course of what was unfolding. Jalen Adams, Turner read aloud, his voice dripping with a mocking gravity, as if the name itself were an indictment. Got any priors, anything I should know about? Jalen shook his head, his jaw tight. No, sir. Turner tossed the ID back with a careless flick, his gaze never warming. Well, maybe we should do a quick check. Make sure you're clean. Jalen's breath hitched, his pulse hammering in his temples. He wanted to protest, to demand an explanation, to ask what he'd done to warrant this, but he bit his tongue, hoping silence might bore Turner into letting him go. It didn't. You think you're smart, Turner hissed, his voice dropping to a near whisper, venomous and intimate. Walking around like you own the place. The accusation hung heavy between them, a silent indictment of something Jalen couldn't name. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his shoulders stiffening. But he forced his voice to remain steady. I'm just trying to get home, officer, he said, the strain bleeding through despite his efforts. Turner's eyes flicked over him again, probing, searching, as if he could peel back Jalen's skin and find the guilt he was so sure lay beneath. Then, with a suddenness that stole Jalen's breath, Turner lunged forward, his hand clamping onto Jalen's shoulder with a roughness that sent a jolt of shock through him. Hands on the hood, Turner barked, his voice cold and unyielding. Jalen stumbled, the cruiser's metal biting into his cheek as Turner twisted his arms behind his back. With a practiced, almost cruel precision, the cuff snapped shut, icy and tight around his wrists, and Jalen gritted his teeth against the sting, swallowing a wince. Humiliation sank into him, deep and bruising, a wound no one could see. Reed stood back, his face paling, his hands fidgeting as if he didn't know what to do with them. His mouth opened, a breath of hesitation escaping, but no words followed. The protocol, the unspoken code of backing his partner, held him in place like a chain. Turner shoved Jalen into the cruiser's back seat, slamming the door with a force that reverberated down the empty street. As the car pulled away, Jalen sat in silence, his mind a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. His wrists ached, his pride lay in tatters, but beneath it all, a spark of something fiercer began to kindle. The city blurred past the window, its lights smearing into streaks of color as the cruiser cut through the night. Jalen's thoughts drifted to his father, a man who'd worn the same uniform these officers did, a man who'd believed in the law as a force for good, a shield for justice. But tonight, justice felt like a hollow word, a promise broken by the very hands meant to uphold it. Turner and Reed didn't know who they'd just arrested, didn't know the legacy they'd brushed against or the consequences that would ripple from this moment. Jalen's resolve hardened, a quiet vow taking root. This time, he wouldn't let it slide. This time, his voice would carry. Morning crept over the city, its golden light spilling across rooftops and seeping into the cracks of the waking streets. Inside the police station, a heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the soft hum of routine shuffle of papers, the murmur of voices. But beneath it all was a tension, thick and unspoken, a current that pulsed through every glance, every step. The officers moved through their morning tasks, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond their walls, a storm born of one man's abuse of power and another's unyielding demand for justice. In the dimly lit confines of a holding cell, Jalen Adams slumped on a rigid plastic bench, his body aching from the night's ordeal. His wrists throbbed where the cold metal cuffs had bitten into his skin, leaving faint red marks that pulsed with every heartbeat. The bruises blooming across his face, dark, angry splotch, served as a bitter testament to the fury that had simmered within him, a rage born of helplessness. Sleep had eluded him, his mind trapped in an endless loop of the evening's chaos, the flashing lights, the barked commands, the sting of humiliation. At first, that anger had roared like a wildfire, uncontrollable and all-consuming. But as the hours dragged on in the stale, fluorescent-lit cell, it sharpened into something colder, more deliberate, a steely determination that anchored him amid the storm. He knew his father would come. It wasn't a question of if, but when. The thought brought a flicker of comfort, though it tangled with the dread of facing him. Then, like a shift in the wind, the sound of heavy footsteps reverberated down the corridor, each thud resonating with quiet power. The station, usually buzzing with the low hum of activity, fell into an uneasy hush. Officers straightened their postures instinctively, their eyes tracking the source of the sound with a mix of respect and apprehension. Chief Leroy Adams had arrived. Leroy was a man whose presence filled a room without effort, a black man who had clawed his way up through the ranks of the police force with unwavering dedication. Decades of grit and integrity had forged him into a figure of quiet authority, his calm, steady gaze carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. But today was different. As he strode through the station, his face was a mask of stone, colder and more unyielding than anyone had ever seen. The officers he passed felt a chill that clung to his every step, a silent storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. They parted wordlessly, their usual chatter dying in their throats as he moved with purpose toward the holding cell. When Leroy reached the bars, his eyes locked onto his son. Jalen sat there, bruised and weary, a shadow of the boy Leroy had raised, now caged in the very system he'd spent his life upholding. The sight struck him like a physical blow, piercing through the armor of his professionalism. For a fleeting moment, his mask slipped, anger flared in his dark eyes, a father's fury at seeing his child broken and confined. But he forced it down, swallowing the emotion with practiced restraint. His voice, when he spoke, was low and steady, though it trembled with the effort to contain everything roiling inside. Jalen lifted his head, meeting his father's gaze. In those eyes, he saw shock, a deep well of pain, but also something fierce, resolve that burned bright and unyielding. He pushed himself to his feet, his movements slow and stiff, his own eyes reflecting a turbulent mix of relief and defiance. "Dad," he rasped, his throat raw from hours of silence and suppressed emotion. Leroy gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable, then turned to the officer stationed by the door. "Open it," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. The officer, a young man with nervous hands, fumbled with the keys. Startled by the chief's icy authority, the lock clicked, and the door swung open with a reluctant groan. Jalen stepped forward, rubbing his sore wrists, his eyes never leaving his father's face. 1,000 unspoken questions hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. As they walked in silence down the hallway toward Leroy's office, the station's fluorescent lights cast long shadows, amplifying the tension that pulsed with every step. Inside the office, Leroy shut the door with a soft click, gesturing for Jalen to take a seat. He settled into the chair across from his son, his gaze tracing the dark bruises marring Jalen's cheek, the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. For the first time, Leroy felt the full weight of his role not as a chief, but as a father, a burden that pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. The silence stretched between them, dense with all the words they couldn't yet say. Finally, Leroy broke it, his voice low and controlled, though it carried the undercurrent of a man wrestling with his own limits. "Tell me what happened." Jalen hesitated, his eyes dropping to his hands, his fingers twitched, restless. as if reluctant to relive the night. Part of him wanted to bury it all to spare his father. The pain he knew would flicker in his eyes with every word, but he couldn't hide from this. Not from Leroy. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, he began, his voice a rough murmur that grew steadier as he spoke. He described the stuff how Officer Turner's voice had dripped with disdain, accusing him of jaywalking as if it were a capital crime. He recounted the escalation, the way Turner's words turned sharp and cutting, how the situation spiraled into violence over something so trivial. The bruises on his face throbbed as he spoke, each memory a fresh wound. Leroy listened in silence, his face an unreadable wall. But beneath that calm facade, a tempest churned. Every word from Jalen's mouth was a dagger, slicing through the pride he'd taken in the system he'd served for decades. This wasn't just an injustice, it was personal, a betrayal of everything he'd stood for, inflicted on his own flesh and blood. By the time Jalen finished, Leroy's hands were clenched tight on his desk, his knuckles pale, his jaw locked in a rigid line. After a long, heavy pause, he spoke, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "This shouldn't have happened to you, Jalen. Not to you. Not to anyone." His gaze softened as he looked at his son, a flicker of tenderness breaking through. But his resolve remained ironclad. "But I'm going to make this right." Jalen met his father's eyes, a spark of hope piercing the anger that had gripped him all night. He nodded, drawing a measure of strength from Leroy's unwavering determination. Yet even as his father's words offered solace, Jalen knew this was only the beginning to single step on a long, uncertain road. Leaving Jalen in the office to gather himself, Leroy marched toward the briefing room, his strides purposeful, his mind a battlefield of duty and rage. Inside, Officers Turner and Reed waited, the air thick with unease. Turner lounged in his chair, arms crossed, his face a smug mask of confidence that barely hid his arrogance. Beside him, Reed sat stiffly, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor as if searching for an escape from the guilt gnawing at him. When Leroy entered, both men stood, the room crackling with tension like a storm about to break. "Turner," Leroy began, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "Care to explain what happened last night?" Turner straightened, his eyes glinting with defensiveness as he met Leroy's stare. "Chief, we were just doing our job. The suspect was acting suspiciously janking, giving us attitude. We had to keep control of the situation." "Control," Leroy's voice dropped, cold and lethal, each syllable dripping with restrained fury. "Is that what you call beating an unarmed young man, Mison, and throwing him in a cell for walking home?" Turner's bravado faltered, his face paling as the weight of his actions began to settle in. He shot a glance at Reed, seeking an ally, but Reed's expression was a portrait of shame, his shoulders tightening as he avoided Turner's gaze. "Reed," Leroy said, his tone softening slightly but still edged with a demand for truth. "Is that what happened?" Reed froze, the silence stretching taut and suffocating. Then, with a shaky breath, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Chief, I didn't feel right about it. Turner said we had to keep control, that we couldn't let him walk all over us." I thought he swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "I thought it was just procedure, but I knew it was wrong." Turner's eyes widened, a flash of betrayal igniting his features. "Reed, what are you doing?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. But Reed couldn't stop. Now the dam had broken, and the guilt poured out. "He was just a kid, Turner," he said, his voice growing stronger, though his hands still trembled. "He wasn't a threat. He wasn't doing anything wrong, and we treated him like he was nothing." Leroy's gaze bore into Turner, cold and unrelenting. "You've just heard it from your own partner," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Do you still think you were just following protocol?" Turner's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling under the combined weight of Leroy's words and Reed's confession. In that moment, he saw himself reflected in Leroy's ice-net as a protector of justice, but as a man who'd wielded his power like a weapon, leaving devastation in his wake. After a silence that seemed to stretch into eternity, Leroy spoke, his voice low and unshakable. "Both of you are suspended, effective immediately. There will be a full investigation. And Turner," he added, his tone dropping to a menacing whisper, If I ever catch you disrespecting another young man like Fate, especially one who's done nothing wrong, you'll make sure you never wear a badge again. Do you understand?" Turner swallowed hard, nodding as the reality of his actions sank deep into his gut. "Yes, Chief," he muttered, his voice hollow, the weight of Leroy's words pressing down like a sentence. In that room, justice wasn't just a concept, it was a reckoning. A reminder that power unchecked could corrupt even the smallest acts, and that the consequences would ripple far beyond a single night. For Jalen, for Leroy, and for the officers who'd crossed the line, this was a lesson carved in bruises and resolve. True justice demanded accountability, and no one, not even those sworn to uphold it, was above its reach. With one final, lingering glance over his shoulder, Leroy turned and strode out of the room, his chest tight and his pulse hammering in his ears. Each step echoed with the weight of what had just transpired, a sound that reverberated through the sterile halls of the police station. As he made his way back to his office, his heart raced not from fear, but from a fierce resolve that had ignited deep within him. When he pushed open the door and saw Jalen waiting there, slouched in a chair with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet defiance etched across his young face, Leroy felt the full gravity of the moment settle over him like a heavy cloak. This wasn't merely about his son anymore, though Jalen's pain cut him to the core. No, this was about something far larger, a broken system, a web of corruption and unchecked power that stretched across the entire department, strangling the community he'd sworn to protect. As he lowered himself into the seat beside Jalen, the silence between them was thick, almost palpable, but beneath it pulsed an unspoken pact, a shared determination that would propel them both into the battle ahead. Leroy's mind churned with the realization that he could no longer turn a blind eye to the rot he'd once excused as just how things are. He would fight for his son, for every young man like Jalen who'd been stripped of their dignity, and for a community suffocating under the weight of injustice. This, he knew, was only the beginning of a story that would test everything he believed in. The early morning sun crept through the grimy blinds of the police station, casting long, jagged shadows across the tiled floor as the city outside stirred to life. Horns blared faintly in the distance, and the hum of traffic seeped through the walls. But inside, the air was heavy with the residue of the previous night's chaos. Officers shuffled through the corridors, their boots scuffing against the linoleum with a deliberate rhythm, their faces set in masks of professionalism that barely concealed the unease rippling beneath. The suspension of Officers Turner and Reed had hit the department like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves that rattled even the most stoic among them. Whispers darted between desks, some laced with disbelief, others with a quiet, grudging approval, but no one could deny the shift in the atmosphere. The old ways, the unspoken rules that had governed their world were cracking, and the uncertainty left a bitter taste in the air. For Jalen, the world felt like it had tilted off its axis. He moved through his days with a mechanical normalcy, forcing himself to eat, to nod at friends' concerned questions, to pretend the fading bruises on his cheekbones were all that lingered from that night. But inside, he was a storm, anger and betrayal swirling together in a tempest he couldn't quiet. Every glance in the mirror revealed not just the yellowing marks on his skin, but the deeper wounds no one could see, the humiliation of being pinned to the ground, the cold bite of handcuffs, the sneering voices that had reduced him to nothing. Wherever he went, he felt the weight of invisible stares, some pitying, some accusing, and the hushed murmurs that followed him like shadows. His mother's gentle hand on his shoulder, his friends' awkward offers of support. They all meant well, but they couldn't douse the fire growing inside him. He'd always admired his father's badge, the way Leroy carried himself with quiet pride as a protector of their city. Now, that image clashed violently with the memory of uniformed men like his father, twisting his arms behind his back, their knees pressing into his spine. How could he reconcile the two? How could he trust a system that had so effortlessly turned him into a target? The questions gnawed at him, relentless, and with every passing day, his resolve hardened. What happened to him would not happen to another, not if he could help it. One evening, as the sky deepened into a tapestry of indigo and the stars began to prick through the darkness, Leroy found Jalen on the back porch. His son sat on the weathered wooden steps, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze lost in the vastness above. The sight tugged at Leroy's chest, a mix of love and aching guilt. He could feel the turmoil radiating from Jalen, a silent scream that had lingered between them ever since that day at the station. They'd barely spoken about it, each grappling with their own demons, but the distance was growing, a chasm Leroy couldn't bear. He hesitated at the threshold, the cool night air brushing against his skin, then stepped forward. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice low, almost fragile, as if he feared the words might shatter the moment. Jalen glanced up, his dark eyes guarded but not cold, and after a beat, he nodded. "Sure, Dad," he murmured, scooting over just enough to make space. The boards creaked as Leroy settled beside him, and for a while, they sat in silence, the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of the neighborhood wrapping around them. Like a blanket, Leroy stared at the stars, their faint light blurring as his thoughts churned. His chest felt heavy, burdened with words he'd rehearsed 100 times, but never dared to speak. Finally, he drew a shaky breath and turned to his son. "Jalen," he began, his voice a whisper against the night, "I know I can't undo what happened to you. I know sorry's just a word, and it doesn't fix the pain you're carrying. But I need you to hear me. I'm going to fight with everything I've got to make this right. Not just for you, but for every kid who's been chewed up and spit out by this system. I've been part of it too long, looked the other way too many times, and I can't do that anymore." Jalen's gaze dropped to the porch, his fingers tracing absent patterns in the grain of the wood. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was a raw edge to it, a quiet ache. "I appreciate that, Dad, I do. But it's hard. You've given your life to this job. You've seen it, respected it. I was proud of you." And then he paused, the words catching like thorns in his throat. "After what they did to me, I don't know if I can look at it the same way." Leroy's heart sank, the weight of his son's words pressing down on him. He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening in the dim light. "I get it, son, I do. It's a hell of a thing, asking you to trust something that's hurt you so bad. But that's why I need you with me on this. Your voice, what you've been through, it's the only way we can tear this thing down and build something better." Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze, something passed between them, a fragile thread of understanding, a spark of possibility. For Jalen, it was the first flicker of hope he'd felt since that night, a tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, they could carve a path forward together. In the weeks that followed, Leroy threw himself into the fight with a ferocity he hadn't known he possessed. He organized training sessions mandatory, no excuse, where officers sat in stiff silence as experts dissected bias, and preached community trust. He invited activists and neighborhood leaders to the station, their voices sharp and unapologetic as they laid bare the department's failures. He pored over protocols late into the night, red pen in hand, slashing through loopholes that had let power run wild for too long. Resistance came hard and fast, grumbled complaints from veterans who saw it as betrayal, icy glares from those who thrived on the old ways, but Leroy pressed on, his jaw set and his purpose clear. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a garden cultivated through sweat and struggle, and he'd be damned if he let it wither. The suspension of Turner and Reed had been a warning shot, a crack in the dam, but the consequences were still rippling outward, unpredictable and far from finished. Then came the Meetinga Ra, bruising confrontation Leroy orchestrated in a cramped conference room at the station. Jalen sat on one side of the scarred wooden table, his posture rigid, his face a mask of weary calm. Across from him, Reed fidgeted, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of his chair, his eyes flicking to the floor as if it might swallow him whole. Turner sat beside him, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw tight, but the swagger that once defined him had dulled, replaced by a brittle defiance. Leroy stood off to the side, arms crossed, his breath shallow as he watched, ready to step in but praying it wouldn't come to that. The air was thick with tension, a coiled spring waiting to snap. After what felt like an eternity, Reed cleared his throat, the sound jagged in the silence. He lifted his gaze to Jalen, his face pale and pinched with shame. "Jalen," he said, his voice trembling but earnest, "I'm so sorry. I was wrong, dead wrong. I knew it when it happened, and I know it even more now. What we did to you, it was messed up, and I'll carry that guilt till the day I die." Jalen stared at him, his expression unreadable, his mind a battlefield of warring impulses. Part of him wanted to believe Reed, to see the remorse in his darting eyes and quivering voice. But another part bristled, the memory of that night flashing hot and vivid boots on his back, the sting of asphalt against his cheek. Turner shifted, his chair scraping against the floor. "Look, kid," he said, his voice rough and gravelly, "I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I thought I was doing my job. Been on this force 20 years, seen stuff you couldn't dream of, but that's no excuse. I screwed up, see that now." His words hung there, blunt and unpolished, and Jalen met his gaze, searching for a crack in the man's armor. The silence stretched, taut and aching, until Jalen finally spoke, his voice steady as steel. "I hear you. I appreciate it. But this isn't just about me. It's about every black kid who's been slammed down just for breathing. It's about a system that's rigged to let this happen again and again. If you're sorry, prove it. Stand up when you see it next time, don't just look away." Reed nodded, his face ashen but firm. "I will. I swear it." Turner hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line, but then he dipped his head. A faint glimmer of something regret, flickering in his eyes. "I'll try," he muttered, almost too soft to hear. "It's not enough, I know, but I'll try." Leroy watched it all unfold, his chest swelling with a bittersweet pride in his son's strength, sorrow for the wounds that had forged it. This wasn't healing, not yet, but it was a start, a fragile bridge built on honesty and accountability. In the months that followed, the seeds Leroy planted began to sprout. Turner and Reed were hauled into community service and bias training, their reinstatement dangling on a thread of compliance. The department grumbled, but the changes stuck slowly, unevenly, like roots breaking through concrete. For Leroy, it was a lesson carved in blood and sweat. Power without justice was a hollow shell, and those who wielded it carelessly would face the reckoning of their own making. For Jalen, it was a spark, a fragile hope that the system could bend, if only they pushed hard enough together. The road ahead was long, shadowed by doubt and resistance, but in that shared fight, they found something unbreakably, a bond forged in the fire of consequence, a vow to never let the powerless stand alone again. The air felt thick with anticipation as Jalen stepped hesitantly into the unfamiliar space of a local school auditorium, his shoes scuffing against the worn wooden floor. A sea of young faces turned toward him, their eyes wide with curiosity, some glimmering with a fragile hope he could almost feel in his bones. He clutched the edges of his jacket, his heart thudding unevenly as he prepared to share a story that still stung like an open wound. His voice, soft at first, grew steadier with each word, weaving a tale of pain and resilience that spilled from his lips with raw honesty. He spoke of the night he'd been reduced to nothing more than a suspect. In the eyes of those meant to protect him, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into his wrists, the bitter taste of betrayal lingering long after the restraints were gone. Yet, as he stood there, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, he felt something shift within him, a quiet ember of pride flickering to life. Maybe, just maybe, he could turn that ache into something meaningful, a beacon for others who'd felt the same sting of injustice. Across town, the city hummed with subtle changes, like the first tentative notes of a song taking shape. Communities that once eyed the police with suspicion began to soften, their guarded stares giving way to cautious nods. It wasn't a grand transformation, not yet, just small bridges pieced together with whispered apologies, outstretched hands, and moments of kindness that felt fragile but real. Jayan didn't walk this path alone. Beside him stood his father, Leroy, a man whose broad shoulders seemed to carry the weight of every wrong he'd witnessed in his years as a police chief. Together, they moved as a unit, father and son bound by a mission that had reshaped them both. The ordeal had left scars deep, jagged lines etched into their spirits, but it had also forged them anew, tempering their resolve with a strength neither had known they possessed. Leroy often watched Jayan from the edges of these gatherings, his chest swelling with a pride so fierce it nearly choked him. His son, once a quiet boy shadowed by doubt, had become a voice that pierced through the noisy, a living testament to hope in a world that too often turned its back. One crisp evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of amber, Jayan stood before a group of young men, their faces a mirror of his own younger self, searching, yearning, teetering between defiance and despair. He spoke of the anger that still simmered beneath his skin, a constant companion to the memories he couldn't shake. But he also spoke of purpose, of channeling that fire into something greater than himself. As his words hung in the air, he caught their eyes bright with admiration, heavy with unspoken dreams, and felt a swell of responsibility settle over him. The pain would never fully fade. It was a quiet echo of what he'd endured, a reminder of the fragility of trust. Yet now, he carried it like a badge of honor, a source of resilience that fueled every step he took. Leroy lingered at the back of the crowd that night, his arms crossed over his chest, his weathered face softening as he listened. The applause that erupted when Jayan finished was thunderous, a wave of sound that rolled through the room and settled deep in Leroy's soul. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the noise wash over him, and felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Together, they had faced a darkness that threatened to swallow them whole, a prejudice, fear, the weight of a broken system, and emerged not just intact, but stronger. Their shared vision fixed on a future where justice wasn't just a word, but a promise kept. Meanwhile, the days that followed a tense confrontation in the police station's dimly lit conference room left everyone unsteady, as if the ground beneath them had shifted without warning. Officer Reed, a young man with an earnest face and restless hands, couldn't escape the gnawing unease that kept him awake into the small hours. He sat alone in his cramped apartment, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls, his mind a tangle of guilt and regret. The faces of the kids in his neighborhood flickered through his thoughts, kids who might now see him as a threat rather than a shield. He'd joined the force with a naive dream of being the kind of cop he'd once wished for. As a boy growing up in a rough corner of the city, fair, steady, a protector. But the hurt in Jayan's iced host's dark, piercing eyes that held a quiet accusation haunted him. Replaying in endless loops, words of apology felt flimsy, like paper boats tossed into a storm. He knew it would take more than a muttered, "I'm sorry," to mend what he'd shattered. Turner, Reed's older partner, wrestled with a different kind of torment. A veteran officer with a jaw set like stone and a reputation for never backing down. He'd spent years basking in the glow of praise for his no-nonsense approach. Now, that pride clashed violently with a shame he couldn't quite name. A splinter lodged deep in his chest. He'd always seen himself as a good man, a tough but fair enforcer of the law. But the confrontation with Leroy had cracked that image, forcing him to peer into a mirror he'd long avoided. Each morning, he woke to the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him, heavy as the badge he pinned to his chest. Change felt like a mountain too steep to climb, and part of him a stubborn, defensive part wanted to dig in his heels and pretend nothing was wrong. Yet, in the quiet moments when the bravado faded, he wondered if he'd been blind to the cost of his actions all along. Leroy saw adult struggles of his officers, the ripples of their choices spreading through the community like cracks in a frozen lake. He'd disciplined Reed and Turner swiftly, his voice steady but edged with disappointment, because he knew justice demanded accountability. Still, he understood that true change was a messy, winding road, paved with doubt and resistance. A part of him ached to steer them, to sit them down and map out the path to redemption. But he also knew this was a journey they had to stumble through on their own. They needed to feel the sting of their missteps, to sit with the discomfort until it carved out space for growth. So, with a firm hand and a weary heart, he pushed the department forward. More training sessions, raw discussions about bias and trust, chances for his officers to listen to the voices they'd once ignored. Reed threw himself into those sessions with a hunger that surprised even him. He sat in the front row, his notebook scratched with hurried notes, his ears straining to catch every word. The stories poured out, tales of profiling, of fear masquerading as authority, of lives upended by a single careless choice, and each one landed like a stone in his gut. Slowly, the pieces clicked into place, and he began to see the world through eyes not his own. He started showing up at community events, lingering on the edges with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, watching kids laugh and elders share quiet wisdom. Every nod of acknowledgement, every fleeting smile, felt like a lifeline, a chance to rebuild what he'd lost. One night, after a grueling training session, he caught Leroy just outside the station, the chief's silhouette framed against the flickering streetlights. "Chief," Reed said, his voice rough with emotion, "I just thank you for not giving up on me." His words trembled with regret, but beneath it burned a spark of resolve. Leroy turned, his gaze steady and searching, the lines on his face deepening as he studied the younger man. "Reed," he said, his tone firm but not unkind, "I'm not here to tear you down, but you've got to feel the weight of this if what we carry, every move we make, every call we make. It's not just about us, it's about them." He nodded toward the city beyond, its lights twinkling faintly in the distance. Reed swallowed hard, the truth of it sinking into him like roots into soil. "I get it, Chief. I'm trying. I'll show I can be better." Leroy rested a hand on Reed's shoulder, a gesture heavy with cautious faith. "Then prove it with what you do, Reed. They need to see it, not just hear it." As Reed walked away, the night air cool against his skin, he felt a purpose ignite within him, not just to wear the badge, but to earn it, to become the protector he'd once dreamed of being. For Jayan, the months that followed were a slow unfurling, a healing that crept in like dawn after a long night. He poured his heart into speaking at schools and community centers, his voice steady as he laid bare the trauma that had once threatened to break him. He told them of the fear that gripped him when he was pinned to the ground, the humiliation of being judged before he could even speak. But he also told them of the strength he'd found, the way resilience had bloomed from the ashes of his anger. With every word, he felt lighter, as if he were handing pieces of his burden to those who needed to hear it most. One evening, after a gathering, an older man approached him, his steps slow but deliberate, his eyes glistening with a mix of sorrow and pride. "Son," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I've seen things here that'd make anyone give up. But you, standing tall, telling your truth, you are keeping hope alive. Don't let that light die out." Jayan's throat tightened, a warmth spreading through him like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Thank you, sir," he managed, his voice firm. "I won't." That night, as he walked home under a sky speckled with stars, Jayan thought of Leroy, the man who'd taught him what justice could mean, even when the world seemed determined to prove otherwise. Leroy hadn't just stood by him, he'd fought for him, wielded his authority to right a wrong, and shown Jayan the power of integrity. It was more than love, it was a legacy of strength that Jayan now carried forward. Turner's path was rockier, a steep climb through a landscape of doubt and pride. The showdown with Leroy had rattled him, shaking loose certainties he'd clung to for years. At first, he balked at the counseling sessions Leroy mandated, sitting stiffly in the back with his arms crossed, convinced he didn't need them. But as the weeks wore on, the stories chipped away at his defense accounts of kids stopped for no reason, of mothers pleading for fairness, of lives marked by the shadow of his own hasty decisions. One afternoon, alone in the station, he pulled out a stack of old case files, the paper brittle under his fingers. He lingered on one in particular, a young man he'd detained years ago for loitering, a call he'd made without a second thought. Reading it now, he saw the bias woven into his actions, the assumptions he'd never questioned. His hands trembled as he set the file down, a cold clarity washing over him. For the first time, he saw the man he'd become, not a hero, but someone who'd let pride blind him to the harm he'd caused. Spurred by a restless need to make amends, Turner started volunteering at a youth center, his presence awkward at first, like a stranger in a familiar room. The kids eyed him warily, their laughter fading when he drew near, but he stayed, listening as they spoke of their fears, their dreams, their run-ins with a system that too often failed them. Bit by bit, their words reshaped him, softening the edges of a heart he'd thought unchangeable. He began to see the ripple of his choice show a single moment of arrogance could fracture a life. How power, misused, could erode the very justice he'd sworn to uphold. Through it all, the lesson loomed large. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from above, but a fragile thing built and rebuilt through action, accountability, and the courage to face one's own flaws. For Jayan, Leroy, Reed, and Turner, the consequences of power's abuse had carved deep wounds, but it had also lit a path forward, one they walked with eyes wide open. determined to forge a legacy of trust and understanding from the ashes of what had been. The cool evening air lingered outside the station as the last echoes of a grueling training session faded into the dusk. Reed lingered near the exit, his boots scuffing against the worn concrete, his chest tight with a storm of emotions he'd long buried. He spotted Leroy, the chief, adjusting his cap as he prepared to head home, his silhouette framed by the dim streetlights. Reed hesitated, his throat dry, then took a tentative step forward. "Chief," he called out, his voice cracking slightly, heavy with the weight of regret yet threaded with a flicker of something near-solve. "I just wanted to say thank you for not giving up on me." His eyes darted to the ground, unable to meet Leroy's steady gaze, the shame of his past missteps clawing at him. Leroy turned slowly, his broad shoulders squared, his face etched with lines of experience and quiet strength. He studied Reed for a long moment, his dark eyes piercing yet not unkind. "Reed," he said, his voice low and deliberate, carrying the gravity of a man who'd seen too much yet still believed in second chances. "I'm not here to tear you down or punish you, but you've got to feel the weight of this badge." He tapped the gleaming metal pin to his chest, his fingers lingering there as if it were a sacred relic. "Every choice you make, every step you take, it's not just about you. It's about the people out there, the ones we swore to protect. You carry their trust, their safety, in your hands. Mess that up, and it's not just a mistake, it's a betrayal." Reed swallowed hard, the chief's words sinking into him like stones dropped into a still pond. Rippling through his conscience, he nodded, his jaw tight, feeling the burden settle deep in his bones. "I get it, Chief. I'm trying, you swear I am. I'll show you I can be better." His voice trembled with earnestness, a plea woven into the promise. Leroy's hand landed on Reed's shoulder, firm and grounding, a gesture that carried the cautious trust of a mentor who'd weathered storms. "Don't just say it, Reed," Leroy replied, his tone softening but still edged with expectation. "Let your actions prove it. The community's watching. They need to see you mean it." As Reed walked away, the night wrapping around him like a cloak, he felt something shift, insidious spark igniting where apathy had once festered. For the first time in years, he glimpsed the officer he'd dreamed of becoming as a wide-eyed recruit, not just an enforcer of rules, but a guardian, a pillar for the people he served. The weight of Leroy's faith pressed against his ribs, urging him forward, whispering that redemption wasn't out of reach. Meanwhile, Jalen's journey unfolded along a different path, one paved with the jagged shards of his past, the months since that harrowing night when he'd been reduced to a suspect. In the eyes of those meant to protect him had stretched into a slow, aching process of healing. He'd taken his pain and molded it into something fierce and purposeful, stepping into the role of an advocate. Local schools welcomed him, their halls buzzing with the restless energy of youth. And he stood before them, his voice steady despite the tremor in his soul. He spoke of the trauma that had clawed at him, cold metal of cuffs, the sting of suspicion, the suffocating sense of powerlessness. His words wove a lifeline for the students, a reminder that their voices could pierce through the silence, that they mattered in a world that often turned its back. With every story he shared, Jalen felt his own strength bloom, the scars of his ordeal transforming into a quiet, unyielding power. One evening, after a community meeting in a cramped rec center, an older man approached him. The gentleman's weathered face bore the marks of a life hard-lived, his eyes glinting with a mixture of awe and sorrow. "Son," he said, his voice soft but resolute, like a breeze carrying the weight of decades, "I've seen things in this city that'd strip a man of opulence, mistrust, broken promises. But you, standing here, bearing your truth, you're a light in all that dark. Don't ever let that fire die out." Jalen's chest warmed, a flood of reassurance washing over him, soothing wounds he hadn't realized still bled. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice firm yet thick with gratitude. "I won't," he promised. That night, as he trudged home beneath a sky streaked with stars, his thoughts drifted to his father, Leroy, the man who'd raised him with tales of justice, who'd stood by him when the world turned cold, who'd wielded his authority not for power but to right a wrong. To Jalen, this wasn't just a father's love, it was a towering testament to Leroy's character, a beacon of integrity that had guided him through the storm. For Turner, the road was a jagged, uphill climb, strewn with the wreckage of his own making. The confrontation with Leroy had cracked the foundation of everything he'd once held as truth. His pride, his unyielding stance as the tough cop who bowed to no O'Neat had all crumbled, leaving him raw and questioning. At Leroy's insistence, he'd begun attending counseling sessions, part of the department's push for reform. At first, he'd scoffed, slumping in the chair with arms crossed, convinced he didn't need some shrink to tell him how to do his job. But as the weeks wore on, the stories seeped through his defense accounts from community members, their voices trembling with the pain of being targeted, misjudged, dismissed. Each tale was a mirror, reflecting the faces he'd once reduced to numbers, the lives he'd altered with a single, careless choice. One quiet afternoon, Turner sat alone in the station, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A stack of old case files lay before him, their edges yellowed and curling. He flipped through them, each page a ghost from his past arrests, detentions, moments where his hand had been too quick, his judgment too sharp. One file stopped him cold, a young man, barely 20, detained years ago for loitering near a corner store. Back then, Turner had seen a threat, a punk-defying order. Now, reading the report with fresh eyes, he saw the truth his own prejudice had painted the scene. His bias had twisted the brush strokes. His hands trembled as he closed the folder, a shiver of clarity slicing through him. For the first time, he saw himself unfiltered, a man who'd cloaked his flaws in bravado, who'd let power blind him to justice. Spurred by a gnawing sense of duty, Turner sought atonement beyond the station's walls. He volunteered at a local youth center, a squat brick building alive with the chatter of kids. At first, he lingered on the edges, unsure of his place, his uniform a barrier between him and their wary glances. But as he listened, he'd really listened to their stories, their fears of a world that judged them too soon. Something softened within him. Their laughter, their dreams, their raw honesty chipped away at the stone he'd built around his heart, revealing a man he hadn't known he could be. Time rolled forward, and a year unfurled like a banner of change across the city. Leroy's reforms had taken root, tendrils of trust creeping back into the fractured bond between the department and the people. It wasn't flawless progress, never is, but it was real. Leroy stood at the helm, his pride a quiet flame as he watched his officers evolve. Reed, with his earnest determination, and even Turner, to everyone's astonishment, had begun to embody the purpose Leroy had always preached: accountability, compassion, justice. One warm evening, the city gathered in a sprawling park, its green expanse dotted with families, children darting through the grass, food stalls wafting savory scents into the air. A stage stood at the center, strung with lights that flickered like stars. Leroy lingered near the back, his hands clasped behind him, watching the scene unfold, louder mingling with music, voices weaving a tapestry of hope. This, he knew, was the fruit of their labor, a harmony he'd fought to cultivate. Jalen stepped onto the stage, the crowd hushing as he gripped the microphone. His gaze swept over the sea of face friends, neighbors, strangers united by a shared dream. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice ringing with a strength forged in fire. "This isn't just about me, or my family, or even our police department. This is about you, all of you, standing together, building a future where justice isn't just a word we toss around. It's a promise, a reality, for every single person here." The applause roared, a tidal wave of unity crashing through the night, lifting spirits skyward. As Jalen stepped down, his eyes caught Turner's across the crowd. The older officer stood with a cluster of teens from the youth center, their faces bright with admiration. Turner gave a small nod, a silent thread of respect stretching between them. Not absolution, not yet, but a beginning. Reed approached next, his steps tentative but his expression open. "Jalen," he said, his voice thick with sincerity, "I'm proud of you. I'm trying to be better, to really trying." Jalen's smile was soft, a bridge over their tangled past. "Thank you, Reed. I believe you." From a distance, Leroy watched, his heart swelling until it pressed against his ribs. His son, his officers, his community. He'd walked through shadows and emerged stronger. As the sun dipped low, painting the park in hues of gold, he draped an arm around Jalen's shoulders. Father and son stood side by side, the journey ahead stretching vast and uncertain. But they were ready together. Amid the chatter, the cheers, the gentle hum of hope, they glimpsed a future not defined by division or misuse of power, but by justice, empathy, and the enduring lesson that those who wield authority must bear its consequences with humility and grace. Years of struggle and triumph had reshaped Jolen's life and breathed a new rhythm into the city he called home. The path had been anything but smooth-rugged with obstacles, shadowed by doubt, and steep with sacrifice. Yet, through it all, the city had risen as a beacon of transformation, a living testament to the battles fought for justice and unity. Its streets pulsed with the echoes of those victories, every corner and alley whispering stories of resilience, every heartbeat of its people carrying the pride of what they'd built together. Jolen, once a young man wrestling with the weight of an unfair world, had grown into a figure of quiet power, a community leader whose name rang with respect, not just within the city's borders but across the state. His voice, steady and deep, reached far beyond the neighborhood that had first cradled his dreams, stirring hope in places he'd never even seen. Tirelessly, he poured himself into safeguarding the progress they'd clawed for, determined that it wouldn't slip through their fingers like sand. But as he stood amidst the hum of his city, he realized something profound. This fight, this unshakable devotion to what was right, no longer belonged to him alone. His story had ignited a spark that spread like wildfire, drawing others into a movement that swelled with every voice it welcomed. On the evening before the 5th anniversary of Unity Day, the city gathered to celebrate the legacy they'd forged. The park thrummed with life, families sprawled across the grass, neighbors swapping stories, friends laughing over shared memories. Lanterns dangled from the sprawling branches of ancient trees, their golden light spilling across the scene like a warm embrace. Music floated through the air, weaving through the chatter and the clinking of glasses, while children darted past in a blur of joy, their high-pitched giggles a melody of promise for the days ahead. Jolen lingered near the stage, his broad shoulders squared as he watched the crowd filter in. Their faces glowed with a mix of excitement and quiet reverence, and he felt a swell of emotion tighten his chest. His thoughts drifted to his father, Leroy, a man whose steady presence had been the bedrock of Jolen's life. Leroy had never been one for grand speeches or flashy gestures. His strength was quieter, woven into the way he'd live day after day, year after year, showing Jolen what it meant to stand tall. To Jolen, his father was more than a guide. He was a lighthouse cutting through the fog, illuminating the truth that justice wasn't something you waited for, it was something you built, something you defended, something you handed down like a precious heirloom. Leroy stood beside him now, his once straight posture softened by time, his face etched with lines that told of decades spent serving, struggling, and loving. Retirement hadn't dulled his spirit. He was still woven into the fabric of their community, his hands always ready to help, his heart always open. As he turned to Jolen, his eyes shimmered with a pride so deep it seemed to radiate from him. "I'm proud of you, son," he said, his voice firm yet laced with a tenderness that caught Jolen off guard. "What you've done here, what you've turned this city into, it's more than I ever dared to hope for." The words landed heavy on Jolen's shoulders, a mantle of legacy he hadn't fully grasped until that moment. He looked into his father's eyes, seeing the man who'd believed in him when his own faith had faltered, and a soft smile broke across his face. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad," he replied, his voice thick with gratitude. "You lit the path. You trusted me when I wasn't sure I could trust myself." They stood there, side by side, wrapped in a silence that felt alive with meaning, their gazes sweeping over the crowd, a vibrant mosaic of all they'd fought for. As the chatter quieted and the crowd settled, Jolen stepped onto the stage. The sea of faces stretched before him, each one a thread in the tapestry of their shared story, each one a piece of the journey they'd walked together. He drew a breath, letting the moment settle in his bones, then spoke. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice rolling over the park with a calm authority. "Tonight, we're not just marking the progress we've made, we're honoring the future we're shaping together. This city isn't just a place. It's a community, a family, and I'm beyond proud to stand with you in it." He paused, letting his words ripple through the air, watching as they sank into the hearts before him. We've learned that real change doesn't come quick or easy. It demands that we lean on each other, that we lift each other up. There's still a road ahead, but standing here with you tonight, I know we've got what it takes to walk it together. The crowd erupted, applause crashing like waves, their faces alight with hope and gratitude. As Yulin stepped down, his eyes caught a familiar figure, Turner, standing with a cluster of teenagers from the youth center. Their gazes locked, and for a fleeting second, Turner dipped his head in a nod. It wasn't absolution, not yet, but it was something. A fragile bridge, a whisper of possibility, a sign that even the hardest hearts could shift. Julen's story, woven with Leroy's, carried a weight far beyond their own lives. It was a lesson carved in sweat and soul, a testament to resilience, justice, and the courage to confront broken systems. Julen had once been a young man battered by the sting of discrimination, his trust shattered by those sworn to protect him, but he hadn't let silence swallow him. His voice rose not just from anger, though there was plenty of that, but from a burning need to carve out something better for himself and for every shadowed figure who'd felt that same sting. His father, Leroy, had worn the badge for decades, a seasoned officer who'd walked the thin line between duty and doubt. Yet when Julen's pain spilled out, Leroy didn't turn away. He listened not just to the words, but to the raw ache beneath them, the trembling fury of a son betrayed by the very system Leroy had served. That act of listening cracked something open in him, forcing him to stare down the flaws he'd once ignored. It was a quiet rebellion, a father choosing his son's truth over the comfort of the familiar. And it taught Julen that justice begins with understanding, seeing the wounds behind the cries. The officers who'd wronged Julen hadn't just bruised his body. They'd exposed a rot festering deep in the system, biases so entrenched they shaped every glance, every choice, every blow. When Julen stood up, he wasn't just demanding fairness for himself. He was dragging those ugly truths into the light, daring everyone to look. It was messy, uncomfortable, a mirror no one wanted to face, but that's where change begins, in the grit of honesty, in the refusal to let shadows lie. His journey wasn't a straight shot to victory either. There were nights when the weight crushed him, when frustration clawed at his resolve, whispering that it was all for nothing. But Julen kept going, turning his pain into fuel, his scars into strength. He didn't just survive, became a voice for the voiceless, a hand reaching out to others who'd been battered by the same storms, proving that perseverance isn't just enduring, it's building something from the wreckage. Together, Julen and Leroy stitched their community back together, thread by thread. They bridged the chasm between the police and the people, not with grand promises, but with steady, unglamorous work, listening to fears, answering with action, showing that trust could grow again. It wasn't one man's triumph, it was a chorus of voices rising, a collective refusal to let injustice stand. Turner, once a rigid enforcer of the old ways, hovered on the edges of this shift. He'd been one of the hands that struck Julen down, his badge a shield for his own prejudices. But years of watching Julen's fire into Leroy's quiet defiance had chipped at his armor. That knot in the crowd wasn't much, but it was a crack in the wall, a sign that even he couldn't unsee the truth they'd laid bare. Their story screamed a hard-earned truth. Justice isn't a gift dropped from above. It's a garden tended with calloused hands, watered with patience, guarded with grit. Leroy's push within the police force, Julen's relentless advocacy showed that real change demands more than words. It takes backbone, the kind that stares down resistance and doesn't flinch. Power, when twisted, leaves wreckage, broken trust, shattered lives. But Julen and Leroy proved it can be wrestled back, reshaped into something that heals. Their city stood taller because of it, a living lesson that when you abuse what's entrusted to you, the consequences ripple far beyond your reach. But when you fight for what's right, when you hold each other up, those ripples can build a tide that lifts everyone. The wind howled through the cracked streets of their small town, carrying with it the faint scent of rust and despair as Jayan and Leroy pressed forward. Their boots crunched against the gravel, each step a testament to their unshakable resolve. The world around them seemed to sag under the weight of its own exhaustion. Fade storefronts, with peeling paint, streetlights flickering weakly against the encroaching dusk, and the distant murmur of a community too worn to protest. Yet, within Jayen's chest burned a fire, a quiet but unrelenting fury at the injustices they'd witnessed. Beside him, Leroy walked with a steadier gait, his jaw clenched, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for the next battle. They were an unlikely pair, Jayen, weary and impulsive, his heart a tangled mess of hope and rage. Leroy, broad-shouldered and deliberate, a man whose silence masked a mind that never stopped calculating. Together, they faced a path riddled with thorns, but retreat was a word neither of them knew. Their journey had begun months earlier, sparked by a single, searing moment of cruelty. It was a humid afternoon, the kind where the air clung to your skin like damp cloth, when they'd stumbled across a scene that would haunt them both. In the shadow of the town's crumbling courthouse, a man gaunt, trembling, his clothes tattered in the dust, surrounded by a trio of figures in crisp uniforms. The officers' laughter rang out, sharp and hollow, as they prodded him with their boots, their batons dangling lazily at their sides. The man's pleas were barely audible, swallowed by the oppressive heat and the indifference of the few onlookers who shuffled past. Heads bowed. Jayen's fists had tightened until his knuckles whitened, his breath catching in his throat as he fought the urge to charge forward. Leroy, ever the anchor, had gripped his arm, his voice a low growl. Not yet. We need a plan. That night, under the dim glow of a flickering lantern in Jayen's cramped kitchen, they'd vowed to fight not just for that man, but for every soul crushed beneath the heel of unchecked power. The obstacles they encountered were as relentless as a winter storm. The town's elite, a handful of wealthy families perched in their manicured estates on the hill, wielded influence like a blade, slicing through any whisper of dissent. Their wealth bought silence, their connections ensured impunity, and their disdain for the downtrodden was as palpable as the smog that hung over the factories they owned. Jayen and Leroy faced threats scrawled in jagged handwriting on their doorsteps, glares from neighbors too afraid to speak, and the occasional shadowed figure trailing them through the alleys at night. Once, a brick had shattered Jayen's window, the glass exploding inward like a scream, while he sat hunched over a table strewn with papers, letters, testimonies, anything they could gather to expose the truth. His hands trembled as he swept the shards away, but his eyes blazed with defiance. Leroy, arriving minutes later, had said nothing, only clapped a heavy hand on Jayen's shoulder, a silent promise that they'd weather this together. The townsfolk were a mixed tapestry of soulsome weary, some broken, others quietly defiant. There was Marta, a weary woman with gray-streaked hair and hands roughened by years in the textile mill, who slipped Jayen a crumpled note one evening. Her dark eyes darted nervously as she whispered of secret meetings, where workers shared stories of abuse. She'd seen too much children forced into labor, wages stolen, lives discarded like scraps, and her voice quivered with a fury she could no longer contain. Then there was Eli, the grizzled bartender who'd once been a boxer, his knuckles scarred and his spirit unbowed. He'd overheard the officers boasting in his tavern, their words slurred with whiskey and arrogance, and he'd passed every detail to Leroy with a grim nod. These small acts of courage, like embers in the dark, fueled Jayen and Leroy's mission, reminding them that they weren't alone. Every step forward demanded more than they thought they could give. Jayen often lay awake at night, the weight of their task pressing against his ribs, his mind racing with doubts. What if they failed? What if the cost was too high? He'd picture that man in the dust, his hollow eyes staring up at nothing, and the fire in his gut would flare anew. Leroy, too, carried his burdens, though he hid them beneath a mask of calm. Late one evening, as rain drummed against the roof of his shed, he sat sharpening a pocket knife, his thoughts drifting to his younger sister lost years ago to assist him, that cared nothing for the weak. He'd failed her then, and the memory gnawed at him, a wound that never healed. Yet it was that pain that drove him now, a quiet vow to never fail again. Their efforts bore fruit slowly, painfully, like a tree pushing roots through stone. Words spread first in hushed tones, then in bolder voices. A crowd gathered one crisp morning outside the courthouse, their faces etched with exhaustion and hope, clutching signs scrawled with demands for fairness. Jayen stood at the front, his voice raw as he shouted their truth to the wind, while Leroy flanked him, a steady pillar against the chaos. The officers arrived, their faces twisted with contempt, But the tide had shifted. The people, once silent, now roared, a wave crashing against the walls of power. It wasn't a victor in it yet, but it was a crack in the fortress, a promise of what could be. In the end, the tale of Jayan and Leroy unfurls a profound lesson about justice and the perils of power. Unchecked, it's a mirror held up to the soul, asking us to look hard at the world we've built. Their story whispers to us across the miles and years, urging us to rise when we see wrong, to listen with hearts wide open, to act even when the path is steep and shadowed. Change, they teach us, is a beast that fights to stay caged, but with courage raw, stubborn, unyielding, it can be set free. Their fight wasn't just theirs, it's ours. A call to every one of us to forge a world where fairness isn't a dream, but a foundation. And perhaps most powerfully, it shows that even the smallest spark, a brick through a window, a note passed in the darkened blaze, into a fire that warms us all. Justice isn't a gift bestowed. It's a garden cultivated through sweat and sacrifice, and its fruits belong to those brave enough to tend it.